Okay, it's louder now. It's louder.
Great. Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming together to immerse ourselves in this opportunity of sharing both a rich, wonderful tradition that's been passed down to us for thousands of years, and also to contribute to that tradition as well with our own thoughts and interpretations. This week, we are going to be completing the Torah portion Acharei Mot. So we're going to read chapter 18 in the book of Leviticus. And if you'd like to go ahead and unmute at this time, together we can join in reciting the blessing, giving thanks for this moment. Baruch atah
Adonai
Elohim
melech haolam asher kitshanu mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asot b'divrei Torah.
Thank you, God, for this opportunity to immerse ourselves in words, deeds, and relationships of Torah. We'll read through our English translation of the Torah portion. I'll share with you a bit of a focused study, and then we'll open it up for our collaborative conversation. Leviticus chapter 18. And June, would you like to start at the very beginning of chapter 18 with verse 1?
Thank you, Rabbi. And the Lord spoke unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, I am the Lord your God. After the doings of the land of Egypt, wherein ye dwelt, shall ye not do, and after the doings of the land of Canaan, whither I bring you, shall ye not do. Neither shall ye walk in their statutes. Mine ordinance shall ye do, and my statutes shall ye keep, to walk therein. I am the Lord your God.
Thank you so much. Let me thank you so much, June, and let me invite Dave, if you'd like to read a few verses starting with verse 5.
You shall keep my laws and my rules, by the pursuit of which human beings shall live. I am Adonai. None of you men shall come near anyone of his own flesh to uncover nakedness. I am Adonai. Your father's nakedness, that is, the nakedness of your mother, you shall not uncover. She is your mother, you shall not uncover her nakedness.
Thank you, Dave. Let me invite Jim. Would you like to read a little bit beginning at verse 8?
Thank you, Rabbi. Do not uncover the nakedness of your father's wife. It is the nakedness of your father. The nakedness of your sister, your father's daughter, or your mother's, whether born into the household or outside, do not uncover their nakedness. The nakedness of your son's daughter or of your daughter's daughter, do not uncover their nakedness, for their nakedness is yours.
Thank you, Jim. Let me invite Margot. Would you like to read a little bit beginning with verse 11?
The nakedness of your father's wife's daughter, who was born into your father's household, she is your sister. Do not uncover her nakedness. Do not uncover her nakedness of your father's sister. She is your father's flesh. Do not uncover the nakedness of your mother's sister, for she is your mother's flesh. Do not uncover the nakedness of your father's brother. Do not approach his wife. She is your aunt.
Thank you
Do
so
not
much.
uncover the
Thank you,
nakedness of
Margot.
your daughter-in-law.
Margot?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yes, that's okay. I'm just going to give other people an opportunity to read this.
Sure.
Very
I was
short
on 14.
Thank you. And Gary, would you like to read a little bit beginning at verse 15?
Do not uncover the nakedness of your daughter-in-law. She is your son's wife. You shall not uncover her nakedness. Do not uncover the nakedness of your brother's wife. It is the nakedness of your brother. Do not uncover the nakedness of a woman and her daughter, nor shall you marry her son's daughter or her daughter's daughter and uncover her nakedness. They are kindred. It is depravity. Do not marry a woman as a rival to her sister and uncover her nakedness in the other's lifetime.
Thank you, Gary. Let me invite Susan and David. Would you like to read a little bit beginning at verse 19?
You shall not come close to a woman during her menstrual impurity to expose her nudity. And you shall not give your intercourse of seed to your fellow's wife to become impure by it. And you shall not give up any of your seed for passing to the Moloch. And you shall not desecrate your God's name. I am Adonai. Go ahead.
Oh, and with a male you shall not lie as one lies with a woman. It is an abhorrence. And you shall not put your member into any beast to be defiled through it. And a woman shall not present herself to a beast to couple with it. It is a perversion. Go ahead.
Thank you, Susan, so much. And David. And Justin, would you like to read a few verses there, verse 24?
Rabbi, you shall not defile yourselves by any of these things. For the nations whom I am sending away from before you have defiled themselves with these things. And the land became defiled, and I visited its sin upon it, and the land vomited out its inhabitants.
Wow.
But as for you, you shall observe my statutes and my ordinances, and you shall not do like any of these abominations, neither the native nor the stranger who sojourns among you.
Thank you so much, Justin. Let me invite Robin. Would you like to read a few verses at verse 27?
Yes, thank you, Rabbi. For all those abhorrent things were done by the people who were in the land before you, and the land became defiled. So let not the land spew you out for defiling it, as it spewed out the nation that came before you. All who do any of those abhorrent things, such persons shall be cut off from their people.
Thank you, Robin. Let me invite Robert, if you would like to conclude with verse 30.
Yes, thank you. Therefore shall ye keep mine ordinance, that ye commit not any one of these abominable customs which were committed before you, and that ye defile not yourselves therein. I am the Lord your God.
Thank you so much. Thank you all, everyone, very much for reading our concluding section of Acharei Mot. I'd like to share with you a little bit of a focus study, and then we'll open it up for our collaborative conversation.
That's all that there is.
Yes, because we read half of Acharei Mot last week, and we're reading the second part this week. But just again to place what we're reading in a larger context that I've been suggesting since we started reading the book of Leviticus. The book of Leviticus is remarkable structure-wise because it is the only one of the 5 books of Moses that has virtually no narrative within it. There are really only 2 and very brief narrative components to the book of Leviticus. One, a story dealing with Nadav and Abihu, another dealing with someone who violates Shabbat. The rest of it seems to be a series of prescriptions and prohibitions, a series of rules, descriptions of the rites of the sacrifices. And so when we first started talking about the book of Leviticus, I was suggesting it's quite extraordinary the way the book of Leviticus interrupts the flow of the narrative of all of Torah, from the story of creation all the way up to the Israelites reaching the border of the land of promise. And I suggested when we started reading the book of Leviticus that I view this as a very intentional structural intervention to interrupt this flow of this heroic story from creation through the liberation, through the Exodus, through the journey of the Israelites into the land of promise. And I said at the time when we started reading the book of Leviticus, it is almost as if Torah itself recognizes that this journey from slavery to freedom to responsibility, which is what the land of promise represents, is not a smooth one. And it's not simple for people to merely be freed, and then to rise to the level of sacred responsibility that the story is expecting them to achieve. And so there is this abrupt termination, if you will, of the narrative component of Torah to having a kind of a reflective moment to look at, well, what does it mean to become a fully developed human being? How can we achieve this level of responsibility, this higher level of development within ourselves? And that the book of Leviticus is perhaps designed to give us a series of practices, and they are practices that go beyond the way the language of the text itself seems to indicate, which is that these are practices designed, addressed primarily at the Levites, those who are of the priestly class, of how to conduct these rites and these rituals. And I was suggesting that this is really designed to teach all of us how to move from a lower state of being to a higher state of being. So that's just the general context in which I've been reading the book of Leviticus this year, which is very, very different for me. And I've been learning a lot from looking at it in those terms. When we started talking about Acharei Mot, we were struck with the notion that what does it mean that it's dealing with this issue of death? And the issue of death, of course, is on the spectrum of purity and impurity. At the end of the spectrum that's dealing with impurity, the highest form of impurity is to have contact with death. And what I was suggesting is what it means to come in contact with death is not just physical death. It is any kind of experience that draws one away from the embrace of life and its responsibilities and its mission that we've been given to involve ourselves in this world and to make this world a better place. So that when one has any kind of experiential encounter that causes one to become either so depressed, to become so cynical, to become so surrendering of one's own power, that is a form of death. And so I want to suggest that when we're talking about death here, we're not just talking about a matter of biology. We're talking about primarily something that's spiritual and psychological. So I want to explore in this particular chapter, this particular portion, Acharei Mot, how that might work. And the way I was studying this week's reading was actually inspired by something that Justin said at last week's discussion, where he was focusing on this ritual involving Azazel and the offering up of the presentation of two goats. One goat was to be offered up as a sacrifice, and another goat was to be set free, was to carry with it all the negative experiences and attributes and encounters, and take that away from the community out into the wilderness, and that would somehow help to alleviate the burdens that the community had been carrying as a result of mistakes, errors that had been made. So when Justin talked about that, I realized one of the primary tools that is used in interpretation of Torah, and there are many, is the tool of association. That's a lot of times the rabbis will see a word and they will remember that same word or that same phrase appeared somewhere else in the great story. And even though the context of each of them has no apparent connection with one another, there's something that the rabbis say, this reminds me of this other story. And that other story will help to give meaning and understanding of the other story. So when Justin was having us focus on this notion about the two goats, and one would be offered up for a sacrifice, and then the other would somehow lead to some form of expungement and release, I thought of another story that we've already read. And there's a word that brings the two stories together as well. And it's a story, the other story is the one about another incident where there's going to be an apparent sacrifice, and instead of a human being being sacrificed, a ram is offered.
Abraham and Jacob.
Yes, so this is the binding of Isaac.
Yeah.
So we're going to explore a little bit about what does it mean that these two stories are associated, and the reason they are associated is by a word. And it's the word that starts off our Torah portion. It's the word that it gives name to our Torah portion. Our Torah portion is Acharei Mot, after death. Okay? So if you'll look on your study sheet, if you have one, in number 1, I quote from the very beginning of our Torah portion, Acharei Mot, which reads, Vayedaber Adonai el Moshe, and God spoke to Moses, Acharei Mot, after the death. When I read the word Acharei, and Justin's having us focus on Azazel, made me think of another story of sacrifice. I remembered this word, Acharei or Achar, also figures in that other story. And so if you look on your sheet, we're looking now at Genesis chapter 22, verse 1, which is how the whole incident with the binding of Isaac begins. It begins with these words, Vayehi achar hadvarim ha'ele, and it was after these things, ha'Elohim nisa et Avraham, God tested Abraham. I just want to share with you some of the Hebrew, some of the language, and then we'll begin to explore a little bit. But this word achar is the same as what we've just read in the beginning of our Torah portion. Acharei Mot, after, and achar hadvarim, after these matters. Okay. And then it becomes perhaps even more interesting. If you remember the story about the binding of Isaac, Abraham has Isaac bound, and he has a knife in his hand, and he is holding the knife over Isaac, and a voice calls out and says, stay your hand, don't hurt that boy at all. And with that, Abraham looks up, and then he sees a ram and offers up the ram instead. And here's the way that part of the story reads in the Hebrew. Vayisar Avraham et einav, and Abraham raised up his eyes. Vayar, and he saw, vehine, and behold, ayil achar, a ram behind, the same word, achar, that led off this whole incident about the binding of Isaac, and the same word that started off our Torah portion, Acharei Mot. Something about achar binds together that incident with lessons from this week's Torah portion. The word achar, which I have here on our sheet as an adverb or preposition, comes from the Hebrew verb achar, which means to delay or to tarry. And as an adverb, it means either behind, as in a behind a place, or it means afterwards in the sense of time. Or as a preposition, the same thing, either behind in terms of place or after in the sense of time. I thought about this, the notion that it can mean both behind and afterwards. I thought, okay, if it's the first inning in a baseball game and David Phillips is the first batter, and then Gary Roberts is the third batter, well, let's say the second batter, where physically is Gary as a second batter? Is he in front of David or is he behind David? He's right. He's behind David. He's in the batter's box, which is behind, right? He's in the on-deck circle, rather, which is behind where David is in the batter's box. In terms of when Gary is going to get into the batter's box to take a swing at a ball, will he be doing that in the past or in the future? He'll be doing it in the future relative to David.
That's tricky.
So in terms of spatial definition, Gary comes after David. But in terms of temporal understanding, he will come in the future relative to David. So we have this fascinating, notion that temporally, it's something that connotes futurity, but in terms of spatial relationships, it connotes something that is behind, is in the past, is past someone. So here is this notion in which this word achar combines both past and future in a sense. We're going to explore that. Then to add another level of fascination, perhaps, and complexity and provocation, the same three letters, achar, when it is vocalized as acher, means other or different. So we have a word that has to do with behindness and futurity and otherness. And we've encountered very recently this use of this word, aleph chet resh, pronounced as acher, in a very interesting context. And that is when we were reading about something like a plague infecting a house, if you remember that. Okay. And so from Leviticus chapter 14, we have this: the house shall be scraped inside all around. They shall take other stones, in Hebrew, avanim acherot, and replace the plague infected stones with them. So these other stones are now becoming stones that are capable of replacing an infected substance. And they become source of purification, if you will, for the house. And I want to suggest this, that when we're talking about house, the notion of house, often we will just immediately stop when we come to the definition of house, meaning a physical dwelling place. But house, particularly in ancient societies, house meant a household. It meant a family. And in some of our later literature, a house can also mean this body, okay? So I want to suggest that when we're talking about a house, we're not just talking about the dwelling place with this living room and a bedroom and a kitchen and all that. It's something more than that. But in any case, this notion of acherot, avanim acherot, this otherness is capable of replacing that which is infected with something pure. Okay, so now we're going to go back into exploring a little bit more the story about the binding of Isaac and see what that can teach us about this word, achar, and then we'll bring it back to this week's portion. If you have your sheet, you can turn it over. Many of us are familiar with some midrashim about Abraham. And a lot of the midrashim having to do with exploring the notion that is unexplained in the written text of Torah about why did God reach out to this character named Abram and designate him to be the one to start a whole new approach to God, a whole new way of walking on the earth. And some of those midrashim talk about how Abraham said to his father, Terah, who was an idol maker, you know, those idols, why do you worship them? They're nothing but stone. And then Abraham smashes all these idols. So we've read, perhaps some of us have read some of these stories, these midrashim about Abraham smashing his father's idols. Well, there are some follow-up midrashim to explore what the consequences were of Abraham doing that. And they tell a dark story. And to summarize where some of those midrashim go in describing what were the consequences of Abraham smashing his father's idols, they basically describe a story where Abraham's father, Terah, is so infuriated that what his son has done, that he takes Abraham to the ruler of the land where they're living, King Nimrod, and says, he has destroyed my idols, the idols that we worship here. And Nimrod then throws Abraham into a fiery pit. That's horrifying enough. The notion that his father has handed Abraham off to this sovereign who then throws Abraham into this fiery pit, ostensibly to his death. Well, it gets darker because Abraham has a brother named Haran, and Haran becomes a kind of collaborator, or at least a quiet participant in this deed of presuming to be Abraham's death. And here's one. When Abraham shattered Terah's idols, they threw him into a fiery furnace, and Haran stood by, adding fuel to the fire, and was enthusiastic about the flames. So there's one midrash that has Haran looking at his brother being tossed into this fiery pit, and then Haran hears Nimrod say to him, to Haran, and what do you think about what your brother did? And Haran has this thought process, says, well, if Abraham survives this encounter with death, then I'll say, well, I'm with him, because obviously he's onto something that he can survive being thrown into a fiery pit. If he dies, Haran says, I'll say, I was always against him. In this one, it gets even worse because it's not just a passive kind of playing both sides that Haran's doing. Here, Haran seems to be enthusiastic that there are these fires. So we have so far this notion that Abraham is about to be killed as a result of the actions of his father, who's handed him over to Nimrod, whose death perhaps was being cheered on by his brother. And then there's another dark component to this. And it's based upon some play of words that we see towards the end of the portion that immediately precedes Lech Lecha, where it says, Haran, Abraham's brother, died al pnei his father Terach. And oftentimes that phrase al pnei is translated as in the presence of, meaning at the face of his father, in the presence of his father. But some Midrashim translate it a little differently, and they would translate it as not in the presence of his father, but at the hands of his father. Why? Because the notion is that there's Midrash that when Abraham didn't die, then Haran was thrown into the pit as well. So Abraham survives, according to this collection of stories. Abraham survives with the memory that his father had handed him off to Nimrod to be thrown into a fiery pit, that his brother perhaps was complicit or cheered on, or even just merely stood by, and that as a result of his surviving this ritual, his brother dies in his place. So we now turn back to this notion that we started off this story about the binding of Isaac, which, if you remember, starts off this way. Vayhi achar hadavarim cha'ela, v'cha'elihim nisa et Avraham. It was after these things that God tested Abraham. The rabbis look at this and they say, after what things? What does it mean when it says after these things? What are these things that preceded this moment of this terrible encounter up on Mount Moriah? Okay. And so the rabbis want to know, essentially, Achar, what is behind this moment? What is the history that has led up to this moment? So one of our great modern commentators, Aviva Zornberg, notes that the Hebrew, when it comes time for Abraham to see the ram that's behind him, it doesn't have what really should have been grammatically correct for behind him, which would have been something like acharav, behind him. It just says achar. It just says the ram is achar, behind. Here is what Aviva Zornberg says about this moment. The ram, whose horns will offer atonement for the future, is to be found in the world of Achar, Hadavarim, Ha'ila, where what lies behind the apparent facts, what happened before, the residues of the past suffuse the present. What she's telling us, in perhaps a more contemporary language, is what the rabbis have all been hinting at with their various midrashim, which is this, is that Abraham suffered a deep and profound trauma as a boy, a young man. His father handing him off to be killed, his brother perhaps complicit with it, and then his brother dying in his place because he survived this rite. It is a moment that doesn't appear in our text. And the fact that it doesn't appear in our written text itself hints at some kind of suppressed traumatic experience, which requires some deep reading in order to tease back out to the surface. And the ram, the ahar, is meant to help us see that it is in the behind this moment where one can find the salvation for the present. And the ahar, in a sense, becomes a break with what has been leading up to this moment. It is an opportunity to not repeat the past. Abraham doesn't have to kill his son the way his father perhaps tried to kill him. The ahar becomes acher, if you will. It becomes another way. It becomes other. It becomes a break with this history that has been embedded subconsciously and suppressed within Abraham's own life experience. The Akedah in this reading becomes a deeply dramatic therapeutic moment. The Akedah really is not a trial designed to test Abraham's loyalty to God. If you want to read it in kind of contemporary words, God here is now acting as a therapist, taking Abraham back through a deeply traumatic experience in which he encountered death of his brother, perhaps, a near death of his own at the hands of someone he thought loved him and cared for him. And he's helping, God, in a sense, is helping Abraham relive that experience through his own relationship with his son Isaac. And it's now provoking that suppressed experience to come to the surface. He can see it for what it was, and he doesn't have to live it out again. He can have a different approach to those same dynamics of son, father, and sacrifice. This notion about dealing with trauma, I want to suggest, is what Acharei Mot is also about. Remember, Aaron is dealing with the death of his two sons. And the notion that trauma is something that we all experience to some degree or other. The very nature of being born, in a sense, is traumatic. To be separated from attachment to all of unified existence is traumatic. And if we're fortunate, we're born individuated into a loving, caring, nurturing family. If we're not so fortunate, we experience something that can be quite grievous to our psychic well-being. So the question is, how do we carry this traumatic experience with us? Do we suppress it? Or is there some way to live through it and to re-examine those moments of trauma and free ourselves from their control over us. So let me share with you, this is a definition of trauma from the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders from the American Psychiatric Association. Trauma occurs when the person experienced, witnessed, or was confronted with an event or events that involved actual or threatened death or serious injury or threat to the physical integrity of self or others, and the person's response involved intense fear, helplessness, or horror. Dr. Judith Herman has written an important work called Trauma and Recovery, and she wrote this: traumatic events are extraordinary, not because they occur rarely, but rather because they overwhelm the ordinary human adaptations to life. Unlike commonplace misfortunes, traumatic events generally involve threats to life or bodily integrity, or a close personal encounter with violence and death. In her book, she lays out a number of steps of how to deal with these moments of trauma, and they can be summarized with these 3 steps. And they are designed to restore a sense of connection, because one of the effects of these traumatic events is to cause us to feel a break with our connection to others around us and to our sense of harmony and unity and wholeness. And so these are, in summary, the 3 steps that she recommends to restore that sense of connection. 1, to establish some kind of environment of safety in which to explore this. And of course, that's what a healthy therapeutic environment is supposed to do, where the therapist creates an environment where you feel comfortable and being able to explore with the therapist wise prodding and questioning and silence, the opportunity to delve back into some of these experiences. 2, the construction of a new interpretation of the traumatic experience. And then 3, the development of a new self that doesn't feel controlled by the past. Soren Kierkegaard, the philosopher, said, life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. So here's what we've been studying, which is the only way you can understand yourself is to go back to these events that have warped us, perhaps, that have harmed us. But the only way you can live is by moving forward. So you need to, in other words, you need to go back in order to go forwards. Okay. Well, let's take a look at our painting for this week. This is a painting by Marc Chagall, and it's called Paris Through My Window. Chagall moved to Paris, I want to say in 1912. I'm not sure that's the exact date, but I think so. And he painted this in 1913. And what, of course, we look at it and we see these fantastic elements to it. You have in the upper right, you have a figure that's parachuting down into the middle of Paris. You have kind of 2/3 of the way down on the right-hand side, 2 figures that are in midair flying headlong towards one another. You've got this double-headed figure in the right bottom corner. And then, of course, you've got the Eiffel Tower. And he called this Paris Through My Window. And one of the things that's quite amusing about it is that, yes, Marc Chagall lived in Paris in 1913, but where he lived in Paris had no view of the Eiffel Tower. He lived in an artist dwelling commune, essentially, called La Ruche, the Beehive. It was a place where on the left bank where a lot of artists live, a lot of Jewish artists live, and there was no way he could have seen the Eiffel Tower. So he constructs this image of Paris, and then proposes to call it, this is what I see through my window. This double-headed figure towards the bottom is intriguing because Marc Chagall had left his village of Vitebsk in order to pursue, well, he had been to St. Petersburg to study art, but he had been arrested twice, at least, in St. Petersburg for being a Jew without a permit to be in St. Petersburg, because he hadn't been able to successfully enter into art school there. And so he was wandering around, and he was arrested several times. And you had to have a permit in order to be in St. Petersburg. So he'd been arrested. He leaves, goes to France, which was the center of the art world. And then jumping ahead, if you will, after the Russian Revolution, he goes back to Russia, and he goes back to his village, and where he is appointed by the communists at the time to lead an art school. And he's eventually he's kicked out of there because his works were considered by the increasingly rigid communist ideology to be too sentimental, to be too particularistic, to be too representational, if you will, for the communist ideology. So he is kicked out of that position. He leaves again. So this notion, this two-headed figure, could be that he's looking back towards this village where he grew up, which was full of the Hasidic culture, full of fanciful stories, full of humor. And then he's also looking towards something that's quite the opposite of that, which is modernity, which is what France represented. It was the height of what today we'll call globalization, the sense of modernity and that which is cosmopolitan. And these are two widely divergent points of view: the insularity and the familiarity and the sense of tradition and the sense of heritage and the sense of storytelling and the sense of antiquity that his village represented, and the undoing of all that, which is kind of what France and Paris in particular represented. So he's looking both ways. He's looking back to the past and he's looking forward into the future. And he finds some way to meld the two together. He constructs for himself a new being who's capable somehow of carrying with him the past while still moving into the future. So let me conclude with this. Acharei Mot, after death. The Torah portion here is trying to begin to offer us some prescriptions of how to emerge out of trauma, some kind of set of guidelines for walking in a way that will help us to avoid falling into the abyss of the death of self. Fascinatingly, the next Torah portion that we're going to read is called Kirushim. I'm so intrigued by the order of these two portions, that we're dealing with ways to deal with trauma. And if we're able to follow a practice that helps us deal with these past injuries and are able to rise above how they have controlled us and limited us in the kind of person that we can be. Where do we get to? Kirushim, holiness. So with that, I'd love to hear what you encountered along the way, what you may have seen, and questions you may have, and thoughts that you have come to. Anna, yes, go ahead.
You know how you often tell us that everything is its opposite, that within one thing is its opposite? What we haven't talked about, what you didn't mention, or I don't believe we mentioned, reading the Torah part that we read today, are all the prohibitions against sexual intercourse with the wrong person. And jumping to the very end, Soren Kierkegaard, we do like our names and things. Life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. Now I'm going to take a little exception to that too, as well as what you presented. The part that is missing there is the present. There isn't any living tomorrow because we're living here now today. You all will just need to pull these pieces together for yourself, because I won't probably get it all set out quite right. The Japanese culture refers to orgasm as the little death, that transcendent moment of non-existence, but totally present existence, transcendent. And Vayada'at et Adonai, I will know God. As I will have intercourse with my husband or my wife, I will have that same word is used for intimate relationship with God. So I'm thinking that we find that right in the middle of all the things that are there and that you have said and talked about. That the way to understand the past and the way to get to the present is to live in the present moment. And maybe God's message to us, one of them in this might be, here's a bunch of stuff that isn't going to lead you to what? It's not going to lead you to me. And the thing that's missing is the transcendent moment in the middle, where we have an intimate relationship with the divine, and where we're blessed specifically and presently and totally consumed by that, and not by any other person. And if we seek that kind of intimacy in anyone else or any relationship that isn't what? Kirushim, right? Which we're coming to, that we miss the track, that we may hurt ourselves terribly and hurt others even more, and we won't have much of a future. But the point is, we do have these present moments, and may you all be blessed in your present moments with God.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. And go ahead. Yes. And Margot?
You know, the story of Abraham and Isaac has troubled me ever since I was in first grade when I learned about it. But tonight put it at ease. You know, the abused often become the abusers, sadly. And I felt Abraham could sacrifice his son because his dad, he was emulating his father. And that makes me feel much better about the story, because I could never understand how he could do it, except now I know he was emulating his father who did that to him. Because, you know, the midrash that I learned in first grade was just chapter 1, and it was wonderful about how he destroyed the idols. And then one more thought. You talked about the need for preparation to become, and think about the 20th century and all of the countries in Africa who have previously been colonies and then just immediately cut off from the colonization. And so many of them are in chaos because they didn't have preparation.
Thank you, Margot. Thank you so much. And let me call on Robert. Go ahead, Robert.
As always, I enjoy these evenings so much. Abraham and Isaac, I want to put a different spin on it. And I want to say, what is faith? It's not for us. So this is my understanding. It is not for us to question God. And that is exactly what we're doing in today's world. We saw in the Torah that there were laws and that these laws were born out of the love of God. So what does it mean to love God? It means to obey these laws. And you mentioned house, which I appreciated so much, but what house is greater than the house of the protection of his love? And so for me, I always look at what Abraham, that experience with Abraham and Isaac, is to say, he doeth whatsoever he willeth and ordaineth that which he pleaseth. And that is the test, as I understand it. So if Moses, for example, and as you know, I'm a Baha'i, so if how will I were to say north is south and south is north, if I really believe he's a messenger of God, I have to understand, why does he say this? There must be some truth to it. And of course, now we realize there is no such thing as north and south, really, when you look at space and so forth. I don't want to digress. I always enjoy these evenings, and I always appreciate the thoughtfulness that each one puts into them, and the passion of your wife as well, by the way.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, excuse me. While we were in New York, this is the slight insertion that Mark Thompson, the cantor, said would be important for me to share with you all, is that a few weeks ago when I read a poem, he thought that maybe there was a misunderstanding that I was reading my poem. Now, most of you who know my husband would probably guess that or understand that it was his poem. I just read the rabbi's poem. I just need to be, for Mark's sake, I needed to say that.
Thank you.
And that's why I thanked you, because I knew it was his, and he won't share it, but you shared it. Bravo.
Thank you. And others about what you encountered and experienced in reading this week's Torah portion or thinking about it. Richard?
Well, I like what you say about the embrace of life and Azalel. The thing about Azalel is we put all our sins on Azalel and send him off. And in doing that, we get them out of our system so that we can go forward. It's not about putting them back in the subconscious and continuing to suppress them. And that, the Haftorah is Ezekiel, and basically he says, all these things that are listed don't do, you guys did them over and over and over and over again to each other. And there's nothing left but dross, nothing left but dross. That's all you are, is dross. But I will collect you and I'll put you in the smelter in Jerusalem and you'll turn to silver. And no, we shouldn't go back to the past. And I think that psychoanalysis is the disease which it purports to be the cure. The well dwell over and over and over. No, we look back, yeah, did that, got through it, but here I am. It's time to be present, to embrace life, and to move forward. And in Ezekiel, that's past, that's back there. And now we're going forward after that's being over with back there. Now we're going forward. And after all that, now you can go forward because I will turn you into silver. And we're still working on that.
Thank you, Rich. Okay. And Justin.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you for presenting this. There's a piece that for me is between the fluidity of free association. Everything becomes, we suddenly move everything. And then there's a sticking point, or there's a place where the gravity somehow takes hold.
Yeah.
And it's certainly in the Akeda. Okay, there's this deep, certainly and the question for me is, I cannot reduce, and this is, again, from the mental health or any other, I couldn't reduce Abraham's religious impulse to destroy idols to being the result of trauma. That would be, I mean, I think when I think look at Emil Fackenheim to mend the world, that I mean, he's just like that kind of, when you're looking at that kind of particular impulse, it goes beyond an explanation like mental illness, or I mean, so there's an intersection here between trauma. I mean, what is the betrayal of these idols? What is that? And I mean, maybe there's a piece of it that's being expressed a little bit in discussing the abomination of worshiping these people. What was this that, I mean, does it really exist on that level, or was Abraham really divinely inspired? You know, and the destructive act of destroying these things as really the initiation of Abrahamic religion, destruction. So I just, I mean, that sounds like a trauma response. I mean, if somebody comes into a room and breaks everything, but that's I mean, that's where Judaism is religiously founded. It's not just trauma. Something else is there. I don't know what it is. I invite anybody to say.
Well, let's, instead of using the word destruction, what if we were to use the word disruption? That Judaism represents a disruption of the way things had been going for millennia. In many ways, that the notion that that what needs to prevail is a sense of power and control over others, and the way to express worship of power and control over others is to be able to effectuate the death of another person. And so perhaps Judaism represents, as the Akedah does, a disruption of that way of that valuation of what's important in this world. That perhaps it's a disruption of the way of trying to fragment the world into many different centers of power, which are tied to specific locations and specific elements in nature. And then a way of life comes as, no, it's all unified. It's all part of one source of life. That's a disruption of the way of life. So that's the way I think about it. And that's, and the Moses at the burning bush, in a sense, is it's disruption of the notion that fire can only be a source of consuming. And then somehow fire then also becomes, there's a story where fire becomes a source of ongoing insight and radiance. And so anyway, these are ways in which Judaism becomes a disruptive, and to use a more contemporary way of thinking about ways of transforming our ways of living and thinking. It's disruptive and challenges the status quo. It challenges the marketplace with a different way of approaching and valuing, what's important. So that would be what I immediately think of. Gary, did you have something? Yeah.
Am I muted?
Yes. No. Go ahead.
I'd like to touch on Kierkegaard as well. Kierkegaard. Before I give my thought, I love what Anna was saying about living in the present, and it reminds me of another one of our great prophets, John Lennon, who once said that life is what happens when you're busy making other plans. But what spoke to me about this quote is life can only be understood backwards. It seems that in today's culture, there's a real big emphasis on intelligence. And when I look at understanding backwards, I'm looking at that as wisdom, looking what happened behind us. And I think that that's one of the reasons I love joining everyone on Thursday night, is that we're studying Torah. And I believe that's where the wisdom is, because this is hundreds, if not thousands of years of our ancestors teaching us a lot of life's lessons. And as usual, when I try to sound these out, Rabbi, I sometimes need you to help me clarify my own thoughts. But I just think that if we could put more emphasis on looking back, taking that wisdom to help us move forward, I think that it seems to help me.
Here's one thing, here's what I hear you saying, Gary, which is that you value having this rich heritage of wisdom from which to draw. And I want to point out to you that things that you're saying find a source. There's a source for what you're saying in here. But you are the one who is shaping it based on your own experiences and based on your own insights. And you are vocalizing this wisdom through your own encounters and your own experiences. You then become a fount of wisdom. You see, the way the rabbis read Torah is there's no inherent meaning in these words. Meaning is found through our encounters and our relationships with these words, which we then give unique expressions to. Okay, so so I want to thank you for being someone who both immerses in this body of wisdom and then gives a unique vocalization to your understanding of it. And that adds to the body of wisdom, which is being passed on to your children. And who knows, God willing, to your grandchildren as well, when the day is appropriate. Okay. So thank you for your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
And anyone else? Yes, Sherry.
Just a couple of things.
A little louder.
Oh, just a couple of things. You know, you made a reference to Frankel's masterpiece, Man's Search for Meaning. And you gave a quote about everything can be taken from a man, but one thing, the last of human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one way. That, you know, it's been years since I read that book, probably I think in college, and it's been 50 years. So I would like to read that again. And that was really interesting. And a book that you recommended on prayer, I ordered, and I was just reading about that today. Where again, you know, the writer was Mofik, I think was his name, talked about, made reference to that same quote from Viktor Frankl. So I thought that was interesting. And just a couple of other things as I was listening to this about the families and about, you know, fathers throwing one son in the fire and then another son goes into the fire. I just finished reading a very interesting book about Ethel Rosenberg, An American Tragedy. And as I was sitting there listening to this today, I thought to myself, this sounds just exactly like the Rosenberg family. I mean, it was, you know, a brother was willing to literally throw his sister into the electric chair to save himself, and all of this stuff that was going on, and the mother and all of this family drama that I didn't know existed until I read the book. So I was thinking about how we look at these different families, and especially you're talking about trauma and whatnot. You know, this is really ancient, all these family dynamics and the craziness that goes on, and the jealousies and the anger and, you know, desires for revenge and everything else that goes on in families. It's just, it was so true in the Rosenberg family. It's true to people today.
So can I pick up on something that you've just said? This is what it reminded me of, to bring us back to the story of Abraham, which is, it's so easy for us one path we can choose in order to move forward is to blame things on those who came before us. So, for example, if all we read was the midrash about Abraham and his father, we could say, oh, well, Abraham was able to embark upon a new path by distinguishing himself from his father. You're just an idol maker, and I'm a monotheist, and I don't want anything more to do with you. You are on the wrong path. I'm on the right path. But what's interesting is that when we read closely the written text of Torah, what's fascinating is we read that his father was headed to the same place that Abraham was headed to. He just didn't get there. And let me see,
On the way.
he died in Haran. Terah was headed to the land of Canaan. He didn't get there. He dies in Haran. And then the story of Abraham picks up. And Abraham ultimately is headed towards the land of Canaan. So Abraham is continuing a journey that his father started. His father just fell short for whatever reason. I don't know. Maybe the car ran out of gas and he didn't have enough money to buy some more gas, and maybe he bought into a business and it went bankrupt, and he just never was able to finish the journey. So when you read closely the text, which some of us sometimes see the separation of Terah's journey, failure, and then Abraham's journey, success. Instead, when we read them more closely, we see that Abraham is continuing something, and it enables us to have greater compassion, allows me to have greater compassion for those who preceded me, who, for whatever reason, weren't able to fulfill all their dreams and their aspirations. And oh my, maybe the same thing will be true of me. Maybe I won't live up to all the high ideals that I'm able to describe. Maybe I will I fall short as well. I hope people who come after me will have some level of compassion for me. So the notion of moving forward based on compassion rather than moving forward by a sense of contempt, I think, is key to having a healthy life. And so I want to conclude by saying I'm so glad to be on a journey with all of you and to feel the level of compassion that you all show for one another, the respect you show for one another, the willingness to learn from one another, and to be contributors to this great story that we call Torah. Thank you so much. God bless you all. I look forward to our next gathering. Be well.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Well, have a good week, everyone.
Right.
Thank you.